Good morning, evening, afternoon to anybody who follows this channel. Today we're going to continue with a week devoted to Flavius Josephus and his history, the War of the Jews. We have already established that Flavius Josephus is a very important historian of early Jewish history for as early as the first century of our era. Through his works, we have very well documented that the land that is now being fought is Israel. That's why it was called during Flavius Josephus' time. And there was no reference to any such word called Palestine until at least 100 years after the death of this historian called Flavius Josephus. We have also established that he is an important historian because he fills in the gap that is left between the Old and the New Testament. In the Catholic Bible, there's a gap of a century and a half. In the Protestant Bible, there's a gap of 4 centuries. How did the Persian Empire all of a sudden become the Roman Empire? Makes no sense. How did the Maccabees all of a sudden become the Roman Empire? Makes no sense. However, Flavius Josephus fills in these facts, these details through his work called The Jewish War. He was, of course, a personal eyewitness of the events because he lived through them. Estamos ahorita con la continuación de la meditación de Flavio Josefo. Veo una conexión, voy a tratar de buscar una conexión al español, ya que este tema ya se ha dado previamente también en español. I have previously given this same topic in Spanish. So let me see if I can find the link to the Spanish-speaking community so they could see the contents of this in Spanish. A ver. Permítanme. Give me, allow me. Vamos a ver, aquí está ya el enlace de Flavio Josefo. A ver los videos que subí de él. I had forgotten to do this part when I was libro 3, capítulo 6. Flavio Josefo, Guerra Judía 2. No. La caída de los Macabeos será esta. Permítanme. A ver. No parece ser esta. A ver, vamos a ver cuál otra viene después de esa. Queda de los Macabeos. Flavio Josefo, la guerra judía, principio del dominio romano, estaría en esta. Vamos a ver. Aún no. Bueno, en otra ocasión, porque ahorita estoy en vivo y estoy perdiendo mucho acerca al respecto. Tiene los Macabeos, principio del dominio. A ver. Ya si no es esta, voy a tener que ver en otra cuestión. A ver. Permítanme, ¿no? A ver. Que tuvo conectando una anterior de esta. La que venía anterior de esta. A ver, caída de principios del dominio romano. Ya la veremos en español. Ya en otra ocasión vuelvo a ponerles el enlace. Ahorita, lamentablemente, por motivos de tiempo, no alcancé a subirles ese enlace para verlo en español. Unfortunately, because of time, I was not able to upload the connection to it in Spanish. As soon as I'm done recording, I will put the link right below. Cuando termine la transmisión, voy a poner aquí abajo en la zona de descripción el enlace para verlo en español. Comencemos. Let's begin. Flavius Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 1, Chapter 5. We have seen, for example, that after the Maccabees had been oppressed by the Greek Syrians for a while, during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the Greeks had persecuted the Jews. The Jews rose up, guided by the Maccabees, also known as the Hasmoneans, and they rose up in arms to free themselves for their rights to worship freely. They were successful, but once they were successful, the fourth generation after the independence achieved by the Maccabees in the year 164. Later on, the third generation, we have this guy called John Hyrcanus, who betrays the reasons for why the Maccabees had fought for independence, and he starts leaning towards the Greek influence, abandoning his Jewish influence. We saw that he had 5 children: Aristobulus, Antigenes, and Alexander Gennaeus. The Aristobulus and Antigenes died through the treason by the queen, who then marries Alexander Gennaeus and has 2 kids with him. We saw about the rule. Yesterday we saw how Alexander Gennaeus was cruel when he was ruling, and how Alexander Gennaeus died in the year 76. Now, after Alexander Gennaeus dies, we're going to see now what happens next. And that's where chapter 5 comes in. Now Alexander left the kingdom to Alexandra, his wife. This is Alexander Gennaeus, the great-grandson of the founder of the Maccabean revolt. He marries the daughter of the high priest. The high priest's name was, let me see if I can remember. The high priest's name was Sheta. Sheta had 2 kids. One of them became another Pharisee, because they were from the line of the Pharisees. And he got a daughter called Alexandra Salome, who was the one who married Alexander Gennaeus. That's the Alexandra we're here reading about right here. Now, she was very religious after all. She was raised along the lines of the Pharisaic movement. This is the Pharisaic movement that turned its back on Hyrcanus when he betrayed his Jewish roots. But later on, Hyrcanus' grandson, um, they become a little more religious, although not quite faithfully to the Jewish religion, but still leaning towards the Pharisaic interpretation of the law. And we also, when we read the Gospels, for example, we find out that there's a Sanhedrin that had so much power. Well, the rise of the Sanhedrin comes from after the fall of Alexander Jannaeus from the control of his wife, because after been in power since the year 104 BC with the first of her husband, Aristobulus, this is the year 104, and now in the year um, 76, she's been in power for almost 30 years. So now her power is firmly established. And Alexander Jannaeus documents that she is to rule the kingdom of the Maccabees. But she was faithful to the Pharisaic interpretation. A lot of the Jews, especially the very devout branch of the Jews known as the Pharisees, they loved her. Um, let's continue seeing. And depending upon it, that the Jews would now very readily submit to her because she had been very adverse to such cruelty as he had treated them with and had opposed his violation of their laws and had thereby got the goodwill of the people. So while Alexander Johannes was still alive, we saw that he was very cruel. He would crucify 8,000 people on a revolt. We sometimes think that the Romans invented crucifixion, but it was more like an invention of um, of the Alexander Jannaeus' group of people. Having said this, oh sorry, I did not send the to share, right? Let's send so that you can see what I'm reading. There we go. Now, whenever Alexander Jannaeus would try and kill people, his wife, Alexander Salome, being more of the religious type, would try to intervene so that Alexander Jannaeus would not commit such adversities. The people saw this. The people saw that Alexandra Salome, the queen, was more devout than her vicious husband was. And they started liking her influence because of this. Um, we see that Alexander Jannaeus, for example, he violated the Jewish laws. However, Alexandra Salome, being a Pharisee herself, was a close keeper of those laws. Nor was he mistaken to his expectations, for this woman kept the dominion by the opinion that the people had of her piety, for she chiefly studied the ancient customs of her country and cast those men out of government that offended against these holy laws. So she wanted to make sure that the people who were in positions of power knew what the law of Moses commanded, and she wanted to impose the law of Moses on those who ruled. So after her husband, Alexander Jannaeus, dies, she starts imposing this law of Moses, and anybody who like her husband, refused to follow the law of Moses, she would terminate their influence as quickly as possible. And she has two sons by Alexander. She made Hyrcanus the elder high priest, one of his age, on account of his age, I mean, as also besides on account of his inactive temper, nowhere disposing him to disturb the public. So the oldest son, his name was Hyrcanus. Mind you, this is Hyrcanus' second. Since he was more devout than the other son, Aristobulus II, after her father, Sheta, dies, Alexander Salome names her son Hyrcanus II as high priest. Um, but she retained the younger son Aristobulus. This is Aristobulus II, with her as a private person by the reason of the warmth of his temper. In other words, while Salome was still alive, um, Aristobulus was kept out of the politics. So there was a temporary peace. There was a temporary in truce, you could say, in the civil war that affected um, the fall of the Maccabees during the time of Alexandra, Queen Alexandra Salome. Many rabbis and many Jewish people see that these 9 years that Alexander Salome ruled as one of the great moments of peace, because no wars, there were no countries trying to take over Israel for the first time in so many years. Remember, this is about almost 500 years after the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. And by this point, they had been ruled by Babylonians, by Persians, by Greeks. And only 60, 70 years earlier had the Maccabees acquired short-lived independence. Her first husband, Aristobulus, declared it a kingdom once again. And during the 9 years that Queen Alexandra Salome ruled by herself without a husband supporting her, Hermano Pepe, good afternoon to you too. And during these years, 9 years that Alexandra Salome was able to rule by herself without a husband by her side, which was very rare considering the attitude society had against women at that time. So that is a testament to the power and the influence she had acquired. So much so that for the first time in 5 centuries, and for probably the last time since then, Israel was able to know some measure of peace, at least while in the 9 years she was ruling. Paragraph 2. Now the Pharisees joined themselves to her to assist her in the government. Okay. Remember, we mentioned that Salome Alexandra was not only queen of the Maccabees, she was also the daughter of the former high priest, Sheta, who was a Pharisee. These are certain sects of the Jews that appear more religious than others and seem to interpret the law more accurately, that is, more strictly. Now Alexandra hearkened to them to an extraordinary degree, as being herself a woman of great pity towards God. Remember, since she was very devout, she tried to rule by what she perceived was the will of God. So she led the Sanhedrin, especially the ones that were consisted of Pharisees, to counsel her in every single element of her rule. But these Pharisees artfully insinuated themselves into her favor by little and little, and became themselves the real administrations of the public affairs. They banished or reduced whom they pleased. They bound and loosed men at their pleasure. In other words, the zeal that Alexander Salome had to rule the Jewish kingdom of the Maccabees at this point was so much so that she wanted to rule it so much so closely to what she perceived was God's will, that the fact that she depended so heavily on the advice of the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin despite all the power that she had, slowly became a way that in which she became a form of a puppet of these Pharisees in terms of her policy making. All at once, they had to the enjoyment of the royal authority, whilst the expenses and the difficulties of it belonged to Alexandra. So, Alexandra had the control of the kingdom, but her policies, her decisions were pretty much made by the Pharisees. Technically, what Josephus is telling us is the Pharisees were the ones making the decisions, and then Alexandra was left with the consequences, whether good or bad, of the decisions that the Pharisees guided Salome to make. She was a sagacious woman in the management of great affairs, and the intent was always on gathering soldiers together. She has seen, remember, while she was growing up, she saw how the Greeks, both from Egypt, because Egypt was being ruled by a branch of Greeks called the Ptolemies, the branch of the Greeks from the branch of the Syrians, how Arabians were, everybody had been trying to take over Israel. Just like right now, you have the so-called Palestinians claiming a land that does not belong to them. So too was the case at this time. And notice, there was no such thing as Palestine back then. So because of all those problems of people trying to take over that land, Alexander Salome saw it very important to gather a powerful army. And that is what she focused a lot of her effort on. So much so, as we see here together, so that she increased the army the one half and procured a great body of foreign troops. So the army, the native army of Alexander Salome, was increased by a half. For every 1,000 men that were in service before she got to rule, for every 1,000 men, now there are 500 more men for every 1,000. For every 10,000 men that she had in her army, now she has an extra 5,000 more men. And in addition to that, she hired mercenaries from other countries. She established certain alliances with other countries through the hiring of mercenaries to help her be militarily strong. And this had very positive consequences, as we're going to see, for her kingdom, and negative for when her children take over. Her own nation became not only very powerful at home, but terrible also to foreign potentates. While she governed other peoples, and the Pharisees governed her. So she became so powerful militarily that those countries who had previously wanted to take over Jerusalem and conquer the land, such as the Greeks, the Arabs, now they're afraid of her because now her army is very powerful. Now she has some influence even on other countries. However, the Pharisees governed her because of her devotion and her wanting to do things based on Pharisaic religious tradition. She wanted to do good by God as the Pharisees interpreted it. Now, accordingly, they themselves slew Diogenes, a personal figure, and that had been a friend to Alexander, and accused him as having assisted the king with his advice for crucifying the 800 men. In other words, Diogenes was a Greek. They're making memory of back when Alexander Salome was still married to Alexander Jannaeus. This is before 76 BC when he was still alive. We know that Alexander Jannaeus had 800 men killed. Who advised them? Diogenes. Diogenes was the friend of Alexander Jannaeus, who perverted Alexander Jannaeus' rule. Alexander Jannaeus refused to follow the line of the Pharisees while he was still alive, and he even followed the advice of his friend Diogenes, who was a Greek. The Pharisees did not like that as much. But when Alexander Jannaeus dies, Alexander Salome tries to reform the kingdom by getting rid of everybody who does not follow Pharisaic point of view. Diogenes was one of them. Diogenes was the guy responsible for Alexander Jannaeus not following the Pharisaic law when he ruled the kingdom. So what did they do? She had Diogenes killed so that he would stop giving false advice and causing so much crime against humanity. Because yes, Diogenes was so cruel, and his advice he tended to give was so cruel. So they ended up killing Diogenes so that there would be no more innocent blood shed through the bad counsel of Diogenes. They prevailed with Alexandra to put to death the rest of those who had irritated him against them. Anybody who had followed Diogenes or Alexander Jannaeus' cruel and not so Jewish ways were themselves persecuted as a form of reforming the Maccabee kingdom. So let's see. We have the first Maccabees. They fought for independence so that they could worship freely. Generation 3 and Generation 4, they corrupted all that, and they forgot the original purpose for the fight, and instead of following the path of the original Maccabees, they corrupted and started going along the way of the pagans. When Alexander Jannaeus dies, Alexander Salome remembers the original reason why the Maccabees fought, which was the right to worship freely, and she starts enforcing that by getting rid of all pagan influence and all those whose advice went directly against the Pharisaic code of law. Now she was so superstitious as to comply with their desires, and accordingly they slew whom they pleased themselves. But the principal of those who were in danger fled to Aristobulus, who persuaded his mother to spare the men on account of their dignity, but to expel them out of the city unless she took them to be innocent. So they were suffered to go unpunished and well dispersed all over the country. So, since Alexandra Salome persecuted those who went against the interpretation of the law of the Pharisees, and who persecuted the non-Pharisaic line, these people would then in turn come back to Aristobulus, and Aristobulus would intercede on their behalf so that their lives would be spared. But when Alexander sent out her army to Damascus under the pretense of that Ptolemy was always oppressing that city, she got possession of it. Now, at home, she was weak. Well, she was manipulated by the Pharisees. But abroad, her military skills were very well recognized. Damascus had been an ally to Alexander Salome, interestingly enough. And this Ptolemy was enemy of the Seleucid dynasty that controlled Damascus. Remember, the Greek Syrians had a civil war that was going on. And there was a branch of the Greek Syrians who went against what their ancestor Antiochus Epiphanes did with their cruel acts against the Jews. One branch of that civil war going through the Greek Syrians decided to side with the Jews to help overthrow the anti-Semitic branch of the Greek Syrians. Remember, there were two brothers who were Greek Syrians, Demetrius and Dionysius. Dionysius was the anti-Jewish king. But Alexander Salome had made an alliance with Demetrius. Demetrius and Dionysius were fighting for the kingdom. Thanks to Alexander Salome's support, Demetrius, the pro-Jewish king, defeats Dionysius, the anti-Jewish king, and that helped establish Demetrius in power. But yet these other Syrian kings, both Demetrius and Dionysius, they were descended from the house of Seleucus. The house of Seleucus had always been enemies of the house of Ptolemy in Greece. So the house of Seleucus was always fighting the house of Ptolemy. This time, Ptolemy invades Damascus, the capital of the Antiochian side. When Alexander Salome's ally, Demetrius, was ruling it. So Alexandra sends troops to help liberate from the attacks of King Ptolemy. Nor did he make any considerable resistance. She also prevailed with Tigranes, king of Armenia, who lay with his troops about Ptolemais and besieged Cleopatra. Now, there was another civil war in Egypt, by the way, and there was another queen called Cleopatra around Ptolemais, which is now known as Akko, on the border with Lebanon. And during that time, the king of Armenia, Tigranes, started trying to take over Egyptian territories. Now it was Alexander Salome establishing peace around the world. Wherever there was a problem, Alexander Salome would send peacekeeping forces to establish a balance of power. By agreement and presented to go away. Accordingly, Tigranes soon arose from the siege by reasons of those domestic tumults which happened upon Lucullus's expedition into Armenia. So now we see Rome finally starting to intervene in the Middle East. At this point, Tigranes is still trying to take over the lands of one of the branch of the Greeks. There is this argument going on. Cleopatra sends forces, and among some of the forces there, Alexander Salome establishes an alliance with Rome. And this is how Rome finally comes in and starts stepping in to try and get some influence. So through Alexander Salome alliance with Rome, they come to what is now the city of Akko, which was back then called Ptolemaida. Notice Ptolemaida, named after the dynasty of the Ptolemies. And now Rome arrives first as just a peacekeeping force, and gradually increased their strength. Lucullus was a general of Roman forces that were sent to vanquish, to defeat Tigranes. Tigranes was the last king of Armenia prior to their fall to Rome. It was through the forces of Lucullus that Rome got its feet started in expanding its powers throughout the Middle East and destroying first the Armenian and Greek forces. In the meantime, Alexander fell sick, and Aristobulus, her youngest son, took hold of this opportunity with his domestics. So Alexander Salome gets sick. She has ruled for 9 years. She was in her 80s by this time. So now she is sick and not being able to exercise as much strength anymore because of her sickness. Aristobulus II takes advantage of this, and Aristobulus II rebels against his mother. Now that she's physically too sick to do anything about it. Which he had a great many, who were all of them his friends on account of the warmth of their youth and got possession of all the fortress. Remember, Aristobulus II, okay, keep in mind, Alexander Jannaeus had been evil and cruel while he was alive. Alexander Salome intervened and interceded for those who that Alexander Jannaeus persecuted. But when Alexander Salome became persecuted people herself, Aristobulus II intervened for them. So just as Alexander Salome became loved by the Jews for the way she protected them against the fury of Alexander Jannaeus, so too people loved Aristobulus II because of the way he intervened on their behalf when Alexander Salome was persecuting them. A little chain follows. History repeated itself. And he also used the sums of money he found in them to get together a number of mercenary soldiers and make himself king. Notice what's going on here. Cleopatra Salome, we are now talking about the year 67 BC. A little part that is not mentioned here, but we will see in ongoing chapters, is that when Alexander Salome died, she had named her oldest son, obviously for being the older one, Hyrcanus II, king as well. But at this time, Aristobulus II is rebelling against both, against his mother and against his older brother. So now the civil war of the Maccabees flares up again. And besides this, upon Hyrcanus' complaint to his mother, she compassionated his case and put Aristobulus' wife and sons under restraints in Antonia. So here we have Alexander Salome, very sick. Since Alexander Salome is too weak to rule, she declares Hyrcanus II king. Or so we are informed by other sources of history. Aristobulus sees this going on, sees that Alexander Salome is too weak to rule. Her brother's the one who is was named king. Now, but he is jealous of his older brother and wants that power for himself. So, thinking that his wife wouldn't do anything, thinking that his mother wouldn't do anything, he rebels against his mother and declares himself king, even though Alexander Salome had already mentioned that Hyrcanus II was a king. So we see the civil war going on there. And Hyrcanus II, having just barely finished declaring king, they were pretty much one day one after the other in terms of the coronations. Hyrcanus II had not yet acquired his power. So he comes and complains to his mom, "Hey, mom, didn't you say I'm the king? How then is it that my brother is the one who has an army and is calling himself king?" So Alexander and Salome gets angry at Aristobulus' um, um, rebellion and punishes Aristobulus' wife and children and locks them up in a fortress that was right next to the temple. Anybody who knows about the geography of first century Jerusalem, they know that there was a fortress that was right next to the temple. This fortress, which was later renamed by the Romans Antonia, well, it was actually also a military camp. So, and it had a lot of prisons there. Mind you, this is the very same prison where Alexander Salome had freed her husband Alexander Eunaeus from. Now, she puts Aristobulus II's wife and children in prison as punishment for Aristobulus II rebelling against the rule of Hyrcanus II and of his own mother, Alexandra Salome. Was for to join the temple. It says here, which was a fortress at the north part of the temple. It was, as I have already said, the old called of old called the citadel, but afterwards got the name Antonia, when Antony was the lord of the east, just as the other cities, Sebastian as Agrippias. So now he's making reference to events that would come 30 years coming in the future. So he's telling us that this fortress where she locked up Aristobulus' wife and children is the same fortress that Mark Antony renamed after himself 30 years later. Their names changed, and these given them from Sebastus and Agrippa. But Alexander died before she could punish Aristobulus for his disinheriting his brother after she had reigned 9 years. So the last thing that Alexander Salome could do as a queen was to lock up the children and the wife of Aristobulus II. Having done that, since she was sick, she dies. Now we are in the year 66 BC. We will leave it here and we will continue with this tomorrow. And like always, long live Christ the King.